Thank you so much for engaging in the chat. Great to see people from so many different areas. Welcome to our Learn at Home session. This week is all about oaks, as you know, and we have a really special guest today, Scott O'Donnell, who I'll be introducing soon. Learn at Home is our Tree People's virtual program. If you could go to the next slide, Scott. And we've been, delivering our educational material virtually ever since lockdown started. And, we have weekly topics, and this week is all about Southern California oaks. So at Tree People, we are very passionate about our native oaks, which is why our logo is actually the Valley oak leaves. And, we know how important oaks are for the ecosystem. So we grow oaks in our nurseries. We plant them for restoration projects in the Santa Monica Mountains and all across Los Angeles. So we're just really excited to learn more about oaks today. Our Learn at Home programming is grown through generous donor support. So thank you to our funding provided by the Gene Senator Legacy Fund, as well as the Subaru in Sherman Oaks. If you go to the next slide. So thank you so much, Subaru. And so we have a very special guest speaker today who I'll be introducing, Scott O'Donnell from UCLA. He's a PhD researcher. My name is Emmy. I'm just here to help moderate this presentation. And so I'll hand it over to Scott.
Great. So hello, everybody. Really happy to be here. It's really great to see so many people turn out. And I know that I'm really passionate about oaks, and it's always nice to see that a lot of other people also share that same sort of passion, especially in California, where they're really just emblematic trees of pretty much every habitat that you can find in the state of California. They're playing some role in shaping kind of the backbone of the ecosystem, providing food for other vertebrate animals and invertebrate animals, and really important to just the function of California as a whole and keeping wild areas wild. Especially in light of the fact that, we live in LA County, and there are a lot of people who live here, obviously, but even with all that and the urban sprawl that's starting to spread throughout the county, there are still plenty of wild areas that you can find a lot of really interesting biodiversity, and oaks play a really huge role in that. So primarily what my research is focused on is the ecology and evolution of oaks in Southern California, and in particular 2 species that I'll talk about a little bit later. But really what I wanted to kind of get started with and just to kind of go over an overview is that what the questions I'm asking are really looking into are kind of associated with both ecology and evolution of oaks in California, and especially how the California landscape is shaped by oaks and how the California landscape also shapes the oak diversity and oak distribution of different species across that landscape. So how the landscape itself is really affecting how oaks are spread throughout the state, and also how oaks being spread throughout the state also allows some of those habitats to persist. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the native oaks of Los Angeles County. I'm sure plenty of you have encountered a lot of the ones that I'll talk about today, but just kind of setting the stage to really talk about what the core thrust of my research is, and that is hybridization between oak species. And again, I focus on 2 oak species in Southern California, but hybridization is something that can occur widely throughout the entire group of oaks, and it's something to really be aware of, and something that if you look for it, you'll probably find it, even though in kind of historical times, people really didn't consider finding hybrid individuals all that common. So just to start off with then, talking about oaks across the California landscape and really taking an ecological perspective of how oaks are distributed across the landscape. So California oaks are really found almost in every single ecosystem that you can find in California, with the exception of maybe the central desert areas in the Mojave Valley, where there really isn't enough water to support anything other than some small herbaceous grasses and things like that, and really small shrubs, and not really enough resources to support oaks. But pretty much anywhere else in the state where you go out into a wild landscape, you're likely to find an oak at some point in some density and in some level of importance to the environment. So just kind of starting off and kind of going through these habitats based off of water availability, because that's usually one of the primary drivers as to where plants can live. Thinking about these high elevation oak pine woodlands. A lot of oak species really mix in with these conifer forests, even in some of the most extremely high elevation habitats and ecosystems that you can find in California. So even in this picture, I know I'm cheating a little bit, not quite Southern California landscape. This is Yosemite National Park, obviously, with Half Dome in the background, but in the foreground, you're still seeing an oak. This is uh, Quercus vaccinifolia, which is a high elevation oak species that kind of mixes in with these conifer species and forms these kind of oak woodlands, even at the highest elevations that humans can really access, and that plants themselves were kind of getting almost to or above the snow line in some cases where these oak species can live. Kind of a very harsh environment, maybe not as much water scarcity there as it is just trying to adapt to the cold and really being limited by how high an elevation you can live based off of how frequent or how severe the frosting events are. But oaks are still a major player in these environments and really a keystone species to the formation of these oak pine woodlands, and numerous oak species will mix in with conifers throughout the entire state of California at higher elevations. Moving on to something that's a little bit drier, but still with relatively high water availability. And water availability, when I say that, I don't just mean how often does it rain, but also, how close to the surface is the water table or things like that can really shape how many oaks can live in an area, how many trees can live in an area, and also, the density of those trees and how closely spaced together they can be based off of how they have to compete for resources. So if you're looking at oak woodlands, these are kind of closed canopy, primarily oak dominated forests where multiple oak species might coexist, kind of forming an almost closed or entirely closed canopy in parts, really dense populations of oak species that you can see sometimes at the middle elevations going down the slopes of some of the taller mountains that you can find in Southern California, where there's really abundant water resources and well-developed soils, a lot of places that these plants can put down their roots. Oaks are going to be the dominant species in these ecosystems, and different species will take the role of the dominant species in these oak woodlands, but also a landscape that you find pretty commonly throughout Southern California in some of the mid-elevation mountain ranges and things like that. Next, we have the oak savanna. So this is another habitat that people are likely familiar with in Los Angeles County, especially if you go up north into the valley and looking at the northern slopes of the Santa Monica Mountains and into the Central Valley and places like that. If you keep going up that I-5 corridor, is this oak savanna where you have these spread out oak individuals, grasses in between these really well dispersed oaks, kind of on these low or kind of shallowly rolling hills, really emblematic of a lot of California landscapes. When people think about oaks in California, I think this is usually the picture that people will kind of conjure in their mind's eye when they're thinking about how oaks look in the state of California. A lot of oak species will be contributing to these type of savanna habitats, but primarily in Southern California, there are two main species that will form these kind of habitats, three counting Engelmann oak, but it doesn't really have that kind of habitat in Los Angeles County anymore, and I'll get into why that's true in a couple of minutes. But these nice, gentle rolling hills, wide open grasslands, really beautiful landscapes that oaks are pretty much the only species that'll grow in this type of habitat, at least as far as tree species go. Next, we have chaparral. So chaparral, even if you might not have heard the term for it before, it's a habitat that I'm sure we've all experienced in Los Angeles County. Pretty much all of the steep slopes of all of the mountain ranges in and around Los Angeles County have this chaparral type habitat. Really starting to get towards the point where there's not as much water availability, either due to how steep the slopes might be or the soil types that might be there, or how close to the water table you are. Can't really support too many large tree individuals, although you see occasional individuals pop up depending on what species is around. And this is primarily dominated by shrubs. And this is one of the main drivers of oak diversity, species diversity in Southern California, is the chaparral type habitat, because most of the oak diversity in Southern California is actually in the shrub oaks. And I'll talk about a couple of them, but I definitely won't touch on all of the shrub oaks that are in Southern California, especially since some of them are harder to identify, especially looking at just pictures. But they're associated with chaparral habitat predominantly because a lot of trees can't really survive in these really, we're starting to get to really harsher environments now where seasonal precipitation and really low water availability in the soil really drives the biodiversity in this community. And finally, we get to the desert or the desert fringe. So obviously you're getting to the point where there's very little precipitation during the year, right on the edge of the deserts where there might still be some drainages off of the mountain slopes. A lot of this is going on in Eastern California, kind of as you get on the other side of the Sierras or into the desert down near Mojave or Anza Borrego, where you start to see these communities start to pop up along what appears to be drainages, but outside of those drainages, really small plants, not really too much grass in between these plants anymore, a lot of open soils, kind of really well dispersed because you're having to compete for resources so much in these areas that it can get really difficult to survive if there are a lot of individuals living really close together. But again, we still have at least one oak species, probably 3 throughout the state, that will live in these desert environments where you wouldn't expect something like an oak to have been able to live to begin with, but these shrubby growth forms really allow them to diversify into these really harsh environments because they have a lot of adaptations to things like drought stress and things like that. So another critical habitat for oak biodiversity, obviously, but also these oaks are going to provide most of the food for a lot of the other animals that are dependent on them throughout this ecosystem. So birds using it for nesting habitat, and obviously acorns. Birds love acorns. Rodents love acorns. A lot of the support for the local ecosystem is going to come from oaks in both chaparral and in these desert or desert fringe environments. Not to understate the role that other plants probably play in those communities, but when we typically think about some of the larger vertebrates being able to persist in something like a desert, a lot of that is due to the fact that there's resources like acorns available. And if you're trying to collect acorns like I was, you have to compete against those animals to try and get those acorns, you are going to lose because those acorns will be gone very quickly. Sometimes they'll pluck them right off the tree before anybody even gets a chance to look at them. Really scarce resources, so the oaks provide a really strong foundation for that kind of environment. So as you can tell, based off of what we talked about, oaks are really strongly defined by their ecology. Obviously, you're not going to find a valley oak in the desert because a valley oak is too big, but you will find other oak species that can live in these harsher environments or different environments, depending on what stress is there. And that can really shape what we talk about when we talk about hybridization in a couple of minutes. But just to kind of refresh everybody about some of the Southern Californian oak species. So we have probably 8 native oaks in Los Angeles County alone, and probably about 19 native oaks, 19 or 20, depending on who you talk to, throughout the state of California. And that's including the Channel Islands. There's some really cool oak biodiversity on the Channel Islands as well, that if you go there, you'll still find oaks, even on an island habitat that probably hasn't been connected to land for millions of years, if it was ever connected to the land at all. So going through the native oaks of Los Angeles County, starting off with this nice, beautiful tree here. This is one of my 2 study species, so we'll be talking about this a lot. And I think I have a lot of Engelmann oak pictures mixed in here, but this is Engelmann oak, kind of emblematic, again, of California. It's one of the species that really forms that oak savanna. Really, really beautiful trees that can grow really well along the streets and things like that in places like Pasadena and Altadena and Monrovia and some of those neighborhoods up there in the foothills of the San Gabriel Mountains. Really beautiful tree, probably my favorite oak personally, but one of the native Los Angeles County oaks. And we have a few other really interesting oaks in this county as well. So getting started, we already talked a little bit about valley oaks. So if you've ever gone to somewhere like Thousand Oaks in the Santa Monica Mountains, or I guess on the edge of the San Gabriel Mountains, you'll see wide open oak savanna. And where you see wide open oak savanna, valley oak is almost guaranteed to be associated with it, north of those slopes, kind of going into the San Fernando Valley and beyond to the north. What's important to note, though, and this will be important when we talk about hybridization a little bit later, sorry, is that valley oak is a white oak. And there are specific distinctions between different groups within the oaks in general that are really important for hybridization. And I'll talk about why when we talk about hybridization. But valley oak is a white oak. It's found in these oak savannas, again, the kind of slow rolling hills, wide open grasslands with very, very large trees kind of spread throughout the environment. Again, really, really dense when you get into Thousand Oaks, where the oak savanna is really prominent up near maybe east of Calabasas and places like that, all throughout that area, going through northeast or northwestern LA County into Ventura County, places like that. Really beautiful tree, can get really big, really old. I feel like if you've seen a valley oak, then that's probably what your stereotype of what most oaks look like in the state of California. Again, Engelmann oak. Engelmann oak is also a white oak. And this picture in particular on the top left here, this is an Engelmann oak. This is probably the biggest Engelmann oak that I've seen in the wild. This little blue thing right here, that would be me. And for scale, I'm a large person. I'm 6'4". So these trees can get really big where they're growing, where they're happy. But in LA County, a lot of the populations of these really big trees, at least in their native habitat, have kind of disappeared due to both urban sprawl and probably climate change and things like that really pushing it over the edge. But you can still find some small populations spread throughout Pasadena, in the foothills of the San Gabriel Mountains. Really, the center of the diversity is down south in San Diego and Riverside counties, eastern Riverside County, and into Orange County, where you can find these really big individuals. They form that oak savanna, really dominant in that oak savanna down there as well. Next, we have, if my presentation will load, California scrub oak. So now we're kind of getting into some of the cryptic oak species that if you weren't really paying attention, if you were going on a hike or something, this is still a white oak. This is still a tree. This is still in the same group of species that other oaks are in, but it doesn't really grow bigger than maybe 8 or 9 feet tall. Has a lot of stems, looks kind of nondescript like a shrub, but it is still an oak, and it is really important to the evolution of oaks. And one of the reasons why I study it is because it's very, very, we like to say it's promiscuous, meaning that it will hybridize with pretty much anything it comes into contact with that is also a white oak. So really emblematic of the chaparral habitats like I talked about, with the shrubs and things like that growing along steep slopes going down into some of the oak savannas. You'll see these on the slopes above the savannas, or in areas where there's a lot less water present. Think of Calabasas, areas like that, up in the northern Santa Monica Mountains, northern slopes of the Santa Monica Mountains, all the way down south to the Mexico border. Pretty much anywhere you see chaparral, you'll probably see California scrub oak. And then going along with California scrub oak, there's also leather oak. It's another shrubby oak species. They're really hard to tell apart. I'm getting my PhD, and I have to be able to identify these, and I still have some significant difficulties being able to identify them without having some sort of backup, either looking at them underneath a microscope or looking at them genetically. But leather oak is primarily restricted to the San Gabriel Mountains and the foothills of the San Gabriel Mountains in the chaparral habitat that's present there. Berberidifolia, California scrub oak, will also grow in those areas, so it makes it really hard to tell them apart without a microscope. I have a pocket microscope. It's great. Costs about $13 if you're interested in trying to look at some of the smaller details about these oaks. We'll talk about that and how to do that a little bit towards the end of the presentation. But again, I didn't want to include too many shrub oaks because they're really hard to tell apart without knowing the ecology of them to begin with, and without looking at them underneath a microscope or having some sort of even genetic evidence to back you up when you try and make an identification. There are multiple scrub oak species found in and around LA County, though. And moving on to the higher elevation species. So canyon live oak is a golden cup oak. So now we have a different group of oaks, really found at higher elevations, really in those mixed oak pine woodlands, especially in Angeles National Forest in the San Gabriel Mountains up there. Once you get higher in elevation, when you get out of the chaparral and things like that, and you find these pine oak woodlands, canyon live oak will be the dominant species of oak in that area, maybe mixed in a little bit with something like coast live oak or interior live oak to a lesser extent. But canyon live oak will really form the backbone in the Angeles National Forest of oak diversity in the higher elevation areas. And then finally, we have a third group of oaks. There are three total groups of oaks. So the interior live oak is a red/black oak. Depending on where you're at in the country, different people will say it's a red oak compared to a black oak, which most people refer to it in California. Again, this is a high elevation species. It lives in the mixed oak conifer woodlands along with canyon live oak. Has kind of a distinctive leaf pattern, leaf shape, things like that. Kind of not that easy to separate between canyon live oak and interior live oak, but the coloration of the leaves might be a dead giveaway if you see one of these when you're out hiking or something like that. Again, this is primarily restricted to higher elevations in the San Gabriel Mountains because otherwise it gets too hot and too dry for it the lower it gets along the mountains. And finally, we have California black oak, another high elevation species, another red black oak. Will also be mixed in a little bit in LA County, but not as much once you get farther east into San Bernardino County and into the San Bernardino National Forest. It's a lot more common. Really nice, pretty lobed leaves, pointed tips on the lobes. Really dominant species in certain parts of its habitat, especially at higher elevations where it mixes in with canyon live oak and some of the conifer species that we have native in the south here. And finally, this is probably the most common oak in Southern California is the coast live oak. And it's really popular as far as tree plantings along the side of the street, as well as just in its native habitat. It can be really dense, can form really thick oak woodlands in some of the drainages, some of the little creeks and stuff like that in and around the drier parts of LA County. Really beautiful tree, has these big spreading crown. The branches are almost scraping the ground in a lot of cases if you have a really big tree growing in the open like this picture here. Really easy to tell the leaves and things like that. I'm sure everybody has some experience at least looking at the leaves. And again, we could talk about some of the ID stuff in the Q&A if you wanted some tips or tricks to try and tell some of these species apart. I wanted to just give an overview for this though, so we can talk a little bit more about what my actual research is. But again, it's another red black oak, really prevalent throughout Los Angeles County and Southern California in general. Really good at living in multiple different habitats. So it can live in the oak woodlands, it can live in the oak savanna, it can live even in the chaparral areas sometimes as sort of a more shrubby growth form, but it's still the same species. Really important to all of the ecosystems of Southern California. Really critical keystone species in this area. So with that being said, and kind of giving an overview and a background in the ecology a little bit about the oaks of Southern California, I wanted to talk a little bit more with the last 15 minutes or so that I've got about hybridization and how hybridization is really important to understanding how we're going to try and conserve oaks in the future, because there can be some positive consequences and there can be some negative consequences of hybridization, but it can be used as an effective tool potentially if we spend some time to really understand the mechanism of hybridization and what it's doing in conserving some of these really threatened or really endangered oak species, and potentially being able to allow other oak species to more rapidly adapt to changing climate and kind of work as a buffer to how severe a lot of scientists are predicting some of these large-scale climatic changes are going to be into the future. So here I just have a couple of pictures from various points in the fieldwork that I've done. Hybrid individuals have kind of intermediate characteristics from the two parental species that make them. So if you have an Engelmann oak hybridizing with a California scrub oak, like on the pictures that I'm showing here, you can have a diversity of leaf shape and size come out of that mating, and the offspring that it produces can have widely different characteristics that could really potentially help in the scenario in which an oak is trying to adapt to a rapidly changing climate, that its previous characteristics of the parental species just aren't up to snuff to keep up with how quickly that climate can change. So kind of looking at those characteristics and how hybridization in general can be used is really what my research is focused on. And I'll walk you through a little bit of what I've been doing and talk about a little bit about some of the techniques that we're using in our lab to really answer the question of whether hybridization can be used in answering some of these conservation questions for oak species and probably other plant species in general. All right, so hybridization in oaks in particular. So the reason why I kind of introduced you guys to the different groups of oaks, they're called sections of oaks, again, white, golden cup, and the red and black oaks, is because oaks within each of those groups can kind of freely hybridize where they come into contact. And where environmental conditions are favorable, you can have persistent hybrid zones really form where you have multiple hybrid individuals living in multiple generations of mating and back
You
crossing
see
and things.
that, right?
And it can really answer a lot of questions about, what does hybridization mean for evolution and adaptation by looking at the underlying ecology that each of those individual species is associated with. So on the left, we have an oracle oak, kind of a named oak hybrid species. And this one in particular is a hybrid between the coast live oak and the Kellogg's oak, California black oak. So one of the main characteristics of this species that's so much different from a lot of the high elevation species where it's living with is that since it's a hybrid and the coast live oak is evergreen, meaning it doesn't lose its leaves, these oracle oak hybrids typically will remain evergreen even in the face of repeated frost events and things like that, that these hybrids can persist in these environments because you have some sort of mixture of the adaptations involved in being a coast live oak where you can live in hotter, drier environments and you don't lose your leaves because you have adaptations to those hotter and drier environments versus a California black oak, which is a deciduous tree, which means it loses its leaves in the winter so it doesn't have to deal with that stress. All of a sudden, the combination of those two give you this evergreen species that lives in high elevation and seems to not really be bothered by it all that much. So just random combinations of different traits can lead to unique adaptations in the hybrids and potentially even can share those adaptations between the species in question. And again, looking at kind of a different example, and we're going to go into much more detail about the one on the right here. It's a cross probably between Engelmann oak and California scrub oak. And again, Engelmann lives in these wide open savannas, really rolling hills, probably has much more well-developed or deeper soil, a lot more moisture available compared to scrub oak, which is associated with chaparral, dry granitic soils, really well-drained soils, a lot less moisture. But all of a sudden, when you cross them, you start to see these shrub individuals. And kind of one of the main questions that I want to ask in my research is, do these shrub individuals have the capability of surviving these harsher environments better, which is kind of the trend that we're seeing in predicted climate models and things like that into the future, where the savanna might be under threat, but if you have a more shrubby growth form, maybe something that is mostly Engelmann or almost entirely Engelmann in its genetic background might still be able to persist even when conditions get a lot more dry than they are now. So again, oaks are heavily defined by their ecology and are adapted to the environments that they're typically found in. And when you start to mix those adaptations together, what if these oak species were allowed to share them between species through a process like hybridization? And again, this could really help them speed up their adaptation to try and keep pace with how rapidly we are predicting climate to change in the future. And especially with kind of the messages that are being driven home lately, where the droughts are longer, they're more severe. There are multiple years in a row where we might get not even just abnormally low rainfall, but critically low rainfall that we've experienced since about 2010 or so in Southern California in particular, in the state of California in general. So if you're looking at a tree to be able to move to a new environment, you're depending on animals moving the seeds to a proper environment for it to grow. That's way too slow for how rapidly we're predicting things like severe drought and things that come with severe drought, like fires especially. Again, another topic that I'm sure all of us are intimately familiar with over the last 5 years or so with all the fires in and around Los Angeles, that if you're having these increasing pressures on some of these species, they're not going to be able to keep up with how rapidly things are changing. So would potentially sharing these different characteristics, these different adaptations between species, potentially help speed up that process a little bit, where they're able to kind of keep up and at least not go extinct even though their climate is rapidly changing, and things like savanna oak habitat are under threat from climate change in addition to things like human development. So the main question then I want to ask is, can we track these traits that they're trying to share or that they could potentially share? And if we can track them, do we use that in conservation to try and promote these species to persist into the future? So again, I'm primarily focused on two species. Engelmann oak on the left there, the big tree, can grow really big, really beautiful tree, really emblematic of San Diego oak savannas, wide open areas, really big Engelmann oaks. LA, not as much. We only really have one population left here, and that's in the LA Arboretum. You can kind of get a taste of what Engelmann oak used to look like if you visit the LA Arboretum. They have a really nice grove there. Probably the last true robust Engelmann grove that we have in LA County, but you can encounter them on some of the hiking trails in the San Gabriel Mountains. They're just not going to be these nice, beautiful trees. They'll be kind of shorter individuals, kind of shrubby looking in some cases, probably a lot of hybrid individuals in there as well. And then on the right-hand side is the California scrub oak, which is just everywhere that there's chaparral. Again, it's really good at living in these hot, dry environments. The ecology that's defining it is that it really seems to be well adapted to drought, extensive drought, periods of drought, and really low water tables in areas where it doesn't have tap roots tapping into some of those water sources down beneath the soil. So if you can imagine then, if you're thinking about this kind of on a macro scale, if one tree is evolved to live in, wetter conditions, cooler conditions, some of these mid-level plateaus that you typically find these Engelmann oak on, and you're combining that with a species that's adapted to drought, would that help the tree species kind of tolerate drought a little bit more if you can have these combinations of traits really spread throughout the Engelmann as a species in some of these areas where it's really under threat? So again, Engelmann oak in particular has a really restricted and really selective distribution in California, and it's endemic to Southern California. It gets a little bit into Baja, Mexico. It's endemic to the California floristic province, but its populations are pretty small, and its distribution, its range is really narrow. So it's basically only found in the mountains, kind of the interior mountain ranges, the coast ranges in San Diego and into Riverside and Orange County are its centers of biodiversity now. And again, it used to get up into LA proper, but between climate change really affecting Southern California and really wiping out some of these savannas, and the added pressure of a lot of those areas being really, really great places to build houses and things like wineries and things that people really enjoy, Engelmann oak is under a pretty heavy threat and is a species of conservation concern because of the multi-pronged threat to its future and its future existence. And it really is a species that could have the potential to end up going extinct if all these trends continue along the way that they're going without some sort of outside intervention. And meanwhile, California scrub oak, like I said, is everywhere. It's one of the more ubiquitous oak species. It's in every chaparral habitat you can find. It can grow in some of the grasslands, depending on the conditions. It can get into the oak woodlands as kind of an understory shrubby thing on the fringes. It's a species that really does not seem to be bothered by rapidly changing climate. At least there isn't any evidence of that yet. I'm sure if things get worse, it could, continue to be a species that is widespread, but we could see some reductions in its population size or something in the future. But as of right now, there's really no evidence that it's being affected by climate change nearly the same way that some of the California tree species are. So again, oaks, Engelmann oak in particular, really prefers these open savannas. So the cooler, wetter habitat, and I included this picture here because in the foreground, you see this nice wide open oak savanna habitat, sweeping grasslands, and this is down in eastern San Diego County, kind of rolling hills. It climbs up these rolling hills and has these really beautiful woodland populations that are in there as well. And it also is living in pretty close proximity to some of the drier areas that chaparral habitat tends to form, that kind of form the cutoff to where it's existing. So if you look in the background of that picture where some of those darker colored areas are, those are kind of transition areas to chaparral or scrub habitat, where you see a lot of California scrub oak, and you see a lot of some other Southern California scrub oak species beyond just California scrub oak that start to mix and mingle into this area that Engelmann oak is known to hybridize with. So in these transition areas, you can have persistent hybrid zones form. And where there are persistent hybrid zones, that means that there's higher potential that you could exchange pollen with one of these hybrid individuals with a pure, quote unquote, pure individual of either of the species. So in that way, you can have gene flow across species boundaries, meaning you can have the traits that are made up of a lot of the evolution that's gone on in California scrub oak make their way into the Engelmann oak. And really, this is where the crux of my research is looking at areas where they overlap in these transition areas and seeing how these traits are being exchanged, what frequency these traits are at, and whether or not we can eventually trace what these traits are through looking at things like genetics and things like that. So just talking about my research in particular. So how do we know if these species are sharing adaptations? It's a really good question, and one I'll try and answer with the last couple of minutes I've got here. So first, you have to go out in the field and you have to find the individuals, right? So fieldwork photos, Emmy requested that I included some fieldwork photos. So this is me underneath a nice pretty Engelmann species that we collected some leaf tissue from. We took the leaves and kind of lined them up with a ruler so we can measure the size and how many lobes those leaves have and things like that, to really see if there's characteristics that we can use to say this is an Engelmann oak, this is a Berbertifolia, or this is a California scrub oak, sorry, where the traits we can use to really determine what those species are if we have some sort of number value that we can assign to those different traits. So just looking at leaf size and leaf shape is one way that you can tell between pure individuals or hybrid individuals where there might be some mixing of these different traits. And also at the same time, we try and look at things like, they're called trichomes, so leaf hairs or trichomes really help you diagnose different species of oaks, especially white oaks, where it can be really difficult. And this is primarily the only way that you can identify the difference between different scrub oak species, is really taking them back to a lab or having a nice little pocket microscope that you can look at the underside of the leaf and see the leaf hairs themselves and the size and density and shape of them to really help you identify different species. So looking at those groups of characteristics, the leaf traits, then I also went back out into the field and collected a bunch of acorns from some of the individuals, depending on how I classified them as either being hybrid or pure individuals in different areas of Southern California. And then finally, I planted those acorns out as a large-scale greenhouse experiment to try and compare whether or not you can see the same traits that you see in the adults in some of the offspring that they produce, and how often you see those traits and how many of their offspring have the same or similar traits that you see in the parental generation that can really help you start to think about tracking how these traits are shared in an environment or shared across species boundaries. So just some fun pictures from the greenhouse aspect of my experiment and some of the really crazy leaf shapes and leaf sizes and different characteristics that you're starting to see in these different little seedlings, just to give you an idea, and to show some baby oaks because I think they're pretty cute. A lot of really weird phenotypes are popping up in some of this. I'm still analyzing the data. This is still an ongoing part of my research, looking at the growth rate and the growth patterns of the leaves, and if they have multiple stems, meaning they're growing up to be a shrub, or if they only have a single stem, meaning they're probably going to be a tree. And as of this, at this point, in this picture on the right, this is my entire greenhouse experiment. About 400 or so seedlings have germinated and have grown. And this is about 8 months in of their growth. And a lot of them are getting really big. Some of them are over like a meter tall now. But going back in with some of these individuals with some of these unique phenotypes and taking them out and measuring them in a similar way to the parental individuals that I looked at before is going to help me track whether or not these traits are persistent over generations, or if new combinations are arising in some of the hybrids when they're back crossing with other individuals of either species, and can really help us understand how these traits are being shared. And then the final step of this experiment is to put all of these seedlings in similar environmental conditions and see if the hybrids are succeeding in hotter, drier conditions where potentially something like a pure Engelmann oak might be failing. So whether or not we can see direct fitness qualities of these different traits when you put them in something like a growth chamber, turn the heat up really high and not give them water for a while, do you see the hybrid individuals that have hybrid traits be able to survive or be able to continue growing at the same pace, where other individuals that are less hybrid or more pure are having a lot of trouble in those kind of environmental conditions? And comparing that across species and which one is better, and if the hybrids are, favoring one species or the other, can really help us answer whether or not these traits are being shared, are adaptive or not. Kind of the central question to what I'm asking. And then just to wrap this up, I think I'm just about at time now. So Engelmann oak, again, is currently under pretty heavy threat. There are a lot of really beautiful populations that are still around in Riverside and San Diego County, but the urban sprawl is really creeping out into their native habitat, and climate change is really, really contracting where some of these oak savannas can still form. And we're losing habitat because of both of those regions. And it's actually been listed as endangered under the IUCN Red List, not at the state level or the federal level now where there's national protection of the species yet, but other scientists internationally are starting to recognize that this is one of the tree oak species that's really in trouble in North America. And really, does hybridization offer a way for us to keep these Engelmann, keep that oak savanna persistent, even if there's a little bit less water there? Does hybridization offer a way for us to keep these species around to where we can still see these beautiful oak savanna habitats in the future? And also, as an added kind of direction is, and what I would like to do is, really look into whether we can help conservation agencies, federal, state agencies, consider using hybrid zones as like a gene flow bridge between these species, and also protect hybrid zones from development and things like that, to allow gene flow between these species to continue occurring, and hope that we get some combination of traits that might allow Engelmann to persist in the environment in the future. And I didn't really talk about this aspect of my research too much because it can get real complicated really quick. I'm happy to talk about this a little bit more in the Q&A session once we finish up here. But can we trace these adaptations using genetics? So can we see that the traits that we are seeing that are helping Engelmann oak survive in potentially my greenhouse experiment are actually from the California scrub oak or not? And we're doing a lot with the genetics and looking at whole genome data and a lot of interesting stuff with that, but I figured I would leave that out unless there were some other people who really wanted to talk about that, because again, there's a lot of jargon and I didn't really have too much time to really get into it, but I would be happy to talk about that stuff in the Q&A session now. So that is all I've got for you guys, and I would be happy to answer any and all questions you've got for the next 15 minutes or even beyond if people want to ask interesting stuff.
Yeah, we have a lot of questions. First of all, thank you so much for your very interesting and informative presentation. I think, with climate change and all of these visible signs that we're seeing of our changing climate, like these are, the kinds of questions that we're constantly asking. And so your research is so relevant. And so we have a couple questions. I got one directly in my email, which was, someone wanted to ask about the stringy growth that's choking off oak trees that hangs from the branches on many oaks. And apparently it is very prominent in the area on the slide you had in Santa Isabel.
Yep.
And
yeah, that's
this or
yeah, it's a lichen actually. And as part of a bigger project that our lab's working on, I'm actually going to be collecting that species of lichen from multiple different oaks. As far as it choking it off, it is potentially a problem, but it's a lichen that's really strongly associated with oaks throughout the environment. And in some cases, different lichens are different individuals are attracted to different oak species, potentially based off of their underlying genetics. So we're really interested in looking at that lichen. I don't think it's necessarily dangerous to oaks as a species. It might be dangerous to the individuals that it might be growing on, I guess, in the long term, but it's not necessarily going to harm oaks as a species. And it's a really interesting example of a symbiote, or maybe in some cases kind of a parasite, that's really host specific, and even down to the species of different oaks, not just oaks as a group, that it's strongly associated with different oak species depending on the part of the range, its range that you're looking at. So it's Ramalina menziesii is the scientific name. I'm not sure what the common name is. My advisor is the one working on that, but I am going to have to go back down into that area and collect some of that as part of this project. It's pretty interesting to me with that lichen.
That is super cool. So second question, this might be a tree people question that we might have to get back to, but I'll ask it. With the management rules so strict for oaks, how can we overcome the obstacles to planting and maintaining more oaks in urban settings? The local and state regulations are prohibitive.
Yeah, I mean, I can offer at least what my experiences are. I would heavily, heavily promote Engelmann oak as kind of a yard tree or a street tree. And in a lot of the Bay Area, they're starting to really catch on to Engelmann oak as like an urban planting kind of thing. And it brings up this other question of assisted migration, and if this is a good thing for us to do to bring a species that's restricted to Southern California to Northern California, some of the problems that might come about that. I would greatly appreciate more oaks in the urban environment. I think that they make really beautiful shade trees, and some of the regulations are kind of unfortunate when it comes to that. But I also understand, because I know that at least the way oaks grow, the tree oaks, is they put down a really huge taproot. And when you're putting down a really huge taproot, that taproot's going to go through any of the piping and things like that that are underneath the soil.
Right.
So while I would love more oaks, I also understand the governmental perspective of, hey, we can't fix this water main every 3 years because that root gets another 1.5 inches bigger or something like that. So I think they make great trees. It's just thinking about the infrastructure is the bigger thing. And I'm sure you guys at Tree People have much more insight into the regulations and how to really work with them and with the government about that stuff.
Yeah, we actually, our next topic for Learn at Home is right tree, right place. And it's all about, covering reasons for specific trees and specific places. So tune in for that as well.
Great, nice segue.
Yeah, it is. It connects. So the next question is also urban. In Mar Vista, the city put in cork oak trees and parkways around 3 to 5 years ago. They are growing okay. However, are they competing with our local natives?
I don't think cork oak is going to be a problem that much. It is pretty happy in Mediterranean climates because it's from the Mediterranean basin in Europe. And it makes a really, really pretty ornamental tree, really pretty street tree, especially I was up at Cal Davis for a conference, and they have a ton of cork oak, and they're really old, and the bark is really thick and really pretty. So I understand why people would plant it. But it doesn't look like there's any evidence that oaks are going to be super invasive because of their life history characteristics. So they produce acorns, and if you can imagine an acorn, it's not going to fly on the breeze for 50 miles out into the middle of some native habitat or something like that. It's really going to be dependent on local flora, local fauna really moving those acorns around. So when you have seeds that are really dependent on local fauna to move around, they're usually not that much of a detriment to the native species, because usually there's not that many local species that are going to move those acorns around and recognize it as food, or they'll prefer some of the native species more than some of these planted invasive species. And in some cases, they don't even produce acorns, so they can't even escape from that planted area. So it's really an open question of whether or not you're being responsible and not like planting them in the middle of the Santa Monica Mountains. Maybe they could be a problem then, but oaks in general, I don't think are that big of a deal when it comes to being an invasive species, at least not in North America. I've heard that they're a problem in Australia, especially since Australia, there's not that many really robust seeds that the local animals like to eat. So oaks are really being moved around a lot in Australia by some of the local fauna.
Very interesting. So segues into the next question, which is which oak species produce edible acorns, is there one that has been historically more important for eating? And are there any hybrids producing edible seeds that could be a sustainable food source in the future?
That's a great question. There's a really, really deep tradition of a lot of the Native American tribes in Southern California really depending on oaks. You know, we are all still humans and we are all still animals because we're humans. And just like anything else in these harsh landscapes, we also would need food when we're living in them, especially without kind of the modern infrastructure. So a lot of the Native American tribes really based their almost a significant portion of their culture around being around oaks, eating acorns and different dishes that they'll prepare using the product that you can make from acorns. I would say that all acorns are edible. It's just really difficult to get them to the point where they don't really, really taste bad. It takes a little bit of prep work. You kind of have to crack open the outer shell, and there's some flesh underneath that, but the flesh is really bitter. You have to strain it in water for a while and really get some of the really sour, really bitter compounds to get out of the flesh of the acorns before you can eat them. And again, a lot of the Native American tribes, the Chumash in particular, come to mind, have a lot of techniques that they use to use acorns as their base food source for most of what they did. Make it into oak flour. You can make it into acorn flour. You can make acorn bread. You can make acorn soup if you use the mash and add water and some spices and things like that. So I would say all oak acorns are edible, but you don't want to eat a raw one. I've eaten a raw one because it's like a tradition for biologists to try and eat their study species. I ate one and I kind of regretted it without preparing it a little bit, but I'm still here talking to you, so obviously it didn't kill me. So it's edible. It's just not going to taste great. Red oaks in particular seem to be the ones that the Native American tribes preferred, though, because their acorns had a little bit less of those compounds in them. Kind of a lot easier to prepare than some of the white oak acorns that I talked about.
Awesome.
And hybrids right now, it's not quite like walnut. I think this question, a lot of people know about walnuts, and we have a lot of hybrid walnuts because there are Asian walnuts and there are native North American walnuts, and mixing them kind of gives you different fruit and different tastes and quality of the fruit. I don't know if people have tried to do that with acorns yet, but it would be a great idea if we're going to plant more oaks. I would support it.
Awesome. We have so many questions coming in. Thank you so much. So moving on. Scott, an important question that needs to be answered is, what is the ability of the hybrid oaks to sustain wildlife? Will they be able, to sustain the caterpillars that birds need for food, for example?
It's a good question. And, you know, I'm not promoting necessarily with my research that we should go out and start forcibly hybridizing things, but there are native ecosystems that are forming that hybrids are kind of forming the basis of them. Like I mentioned, the persistent hybrid zones between species. And the idea is that you don't want hybrids to necessarily take over these habitats, but you would like almost pure Engelmann to still be living in that area, but incorporating some of the positive or beneficial traits without necessarily having too much of an impact on the surrounding environment. So looking at things like leaf traits being important could impact things like other native fauna, but at the same time, you know, the host specificity of a different caterpillar, for example, is an evolutionary trend. And that's something that had to evolve over time, especially with the highly specific ones. They only feed on a certain oak, so on and so forth. That if this is a natural transition, there would be kind of this runway of this open niche that we call it, that you could have things like flora and fauna move into and utilize these intermediate individuals as a food source potentially, and also diversify into being able to use them into the future. So if you're talking about the level of gene flow that I'm talking about with my research and looking into it, again, it's not a California scrub oak and a Engelmann oak has to always mate to make the next generation, but that generation that is formed from that original hybridization event, if that back crosses into either species, over time, if selection is acting on all the seedlings that aren't going to live in that environment, you might be left with just the individuals that retained the good traits, quote unquote, good traits, that allow them to persist in the environment. Now, hopefully that doesn't impact some of the underlying flora and fauna, because otherwise we'd be in for a really big problem, because this is, again, not a man-made situation, at least not completely directly, kind of indirectly maybe.
Right.
It's not a man-made situation where we're making hybrids on purpose
Right.
or advocating that they're being made on purpose.
So yeah, this relates to the next question, which is a philosophical question. So can you say that trees have agency in a short time period to seek out a pairing or cross-fertilization in order to continue the species?
That's actually a really good question, and something that I kind of flubbed because I forgot to mention. All oaks are wind pollinated. So what's really going to determine whether or not you can exchange pollen is whether or not your flowers are open at the same time as other oak species. So having your flowers open at the same time that one species is producing pollen allows the potential for that pollen to land on that flower, fertilize that flower, and result in an acorn that's a hybrid cross. Potentially. There are a lot of hurdles in between that, and it's not like it's easy for hybridization to happen. There are a lot of barriers to that happening, to prevent every individual from being a hybrid and then no species exist anymore. But it's kind of down to chance. And if you're putting up, a billion pollen grains per mating season, and 20 of those happen to land on a different species, and one of those happens to form an acorn, it's all about probability at that point. So the more pollen that's in the air, the more likely it is that you get a hybrid. And kind of the agency of it is restricted to, I guess, the evolution of those species to have the different flowering periods to begin with. That's probably the biggest hurdle to whether or not there's going to be hybridization.
Super interesting. Thank you. So next question is, we live in the Fernwood area of Topanga and have lost several oaks, cracking at the base or falling over on hillsides. Two questions. How can we tend to the existing coastal oaks, and what should we replace them with, knowing that the climate is changing?
Yeah, that's a tough question. If they're coast live oak, and judging by where you live, it's probably coast live oak. There is a disease that's spreading through coast live oak right now called sudden oak death. And I think maybe you were mentioning it, where they just drop all their leaves, they die back really rapidly. It's within 1 year that you have a fully healthy, big, old tree that goes to completely nothing, to falling apart. A lot of other diseases can affect oaks, and especially if the area where you're trying to plant them, if it's too steep, maybe they can't get to the water table as easily or something like that, that trying to plant a tree might not be the best idea to try and replace what's already showing to not be too happy in that area. But again, there are plenty of oaks that will happily grow as shrubs depending on the conditions. There are plenty of shrubs that'll grow pretty much anywhere that you put soil down and a little bit of water. California scrub oak in particular will grow anywhere that you put it down, pretty much, as long as it's got a little bit of irrigation. Not as pretty or as picturesque as the beautiful spreading crown of a coast live oak, but it's a real difficult question with climate change, and what aspect of sudden oak death is driven by climate change is still an open question, I think. If it's being driven by the host plant, it's got a complex life history. If the host plant's distribution is changing because it's getting warmer and that's putting it in contact with it more or something, it's a really open question as to whether or not climate change is strictly causing sudden oak death in coast live oaks. And over time, maybe LA and the LA area will be not a good place for coast live oak. But like I mentioned, it's a pretty good generalist species in general, where it can live in a lot of different environments. So if you're gonna plant a tree and you're in that part of the county, then coast live oak is still probably the best way to go, I would say.
Okay. These questions are flowing very nicely because this relates to the next question, which is, do any of these trees thrive in an urban environment?
Yeah, like I mentioned before, if you want to take a nice drive through some pretty neighborhoods up by Pasadena and Altadena and Monrovia, up there in kind of the southern foothills of San Gabriel's, Engelmann oak does great in people's front yards. And a lot of the oaks that are still in people's front yards are probably remnants of the old groves that used to be there before urban sprawl really took over that part of their habitat. And they really seem to enjoy being in an area where they're irrigated really well, meaning you give them a lot of water. And that's another reason why people in the Bay Area are starting to think about and advocate for using something like an Engelmann oak and moving it up north where it gets a little bit more water and kind of the similar climate otherwise with temperature and seasonality up near, San Francisco and in and around Oakland, because it just works really well as a front yard tree. It's a pretty good shade tree. I think the coloration is really beautiful. It's got this light blue gray color to its leaves and stuff that I would advocate for planting Engelmann more if we can find a good way and efficient way to do it. Its limbs do get a little flimsy. You might have to pay attention to the older ones if they have really long spreading limbs that they might start to fall, but otherwise it's a really good tree to plant. And California scrub oak is a shrub. Like I said, it's happy pretty much anywhere you put it with some sunlight and some water. And, being in a yard, it'd probably be even more happy than usual because it's used to living in chaparral.
Great. So Mike asks, any hybridization of natives with California exotics, Virginia, Suber, or others?
I don't want to rule it out. I don't think I've encountered any directly. And this goes back to one of my previous answers where the flowering time is just different for a lot of these species. And when you're moving something from a wholly different continent that's also temperate, it's going to have a really drastic effect on when flowering time is for those species and whether or not they even are capable of flowering in the right time of the year or if conditions are too harsh. So right now in oaks, I don't think it's too much of a problem. It could be a bigger problem if you start to do things like bring Mexican oaks and start to plant them widely in the area, because Engelmann is kind of a group that's really closely related to those Mexican white oaks, and Engelmann oak freely hybridizes with most other white oaks that it comes into contact with. So if you start bringing in oaks from Mexico, where there's a ton of oak species in Mexico, and start using them as like tree plantings and ornamentals and stuff, then we might see a problem. But the Mediterranean climate's kind of backwards, and it rains in the winter and is really dry in the summer. And that's completely backwards from what it is in Europe. So I think the flowering times are just way off in terms of when and how those trees can flower. So I don't think it's too much of a problem yet.
Great.
East Coast, it might be a problem, but not here.
Oh, on the East Coast, you said.
Yeah, on the East Coast, it might be a problem, but not here.
So how are California oaks related to other oak species like like those that grow in the Midwest or the East Coast?
Yeah. So it's actually a really cool story. Talking a little bit about the phylogenetic history of it. So what scientists kind of agree on, what oak biologists kind of agree on, is that oaks originated in North America about 65 million years ago, and then spread throughout the rest of the continent as the glaciers started to form in the northern areas. It formed up near Alaska, up in Canada. It's probably where oaks came from, as their original center of diversity. So as they spread down into North America and southern North America into the United States, they hit the Sierra Nevada mountains, which kind of split a bunch of those oak species in half, where all of our California natives have been kind of isolated for an extended period of time. And then all the other oak species went to the east of the Sierras and to the east of the Rocky Mountains and spread out into the rest of the continent. So they're all related. All oaks are related. It's just been a really, really long time since something like lobata or valley oak or its ancestors was in very close proximity to something like eastern white oak that's found throughout eastern North America and parts of the Midwest and things like that. Or macrocarpa, I don't remember the common name, Quercus macrocarpa, really the like center of oak diversity in the Midwest. There's a ton of oaks in and around the Mississippi River. All of those are kind of a remnant of that original split. And the coolest part about that story is that Engelmann oak represents like the tail end of them going all the way around the Rocky Mountains, all the way to the East Coast, down into the Southeast US, down into Mexico. And then Engelmann oak is the result of those species making the full circle and coming back into contact with a lot of the California endemics, a lot of the California natives. So Engelmann is a really unique lineage because it's been so long since it was really closely related to some of these native California species, but it made its way back up as climate allowed it to. It's a really cool story.
That is fascinating. Well, to respect everybody's time, I think we have time for one more question. And then, Scott, would you be open to answering some of the questions that we have in the chat via email afterwards?
Absolutely.
Awesome. So we have, let's just go with one more question. What is the ability of the hybrid oaks to sustain wildlife? Will they be able to sustain the caterpillars that birds need for food? Or did I already ask this?
Yeah, I think that was the last question.
Okay. Um, let's go with, what is the best way to replenish areas that were once populated by coast live oaks, particularly to match environmental conditions or phenotype more quickly? Are there any sources for repopulating in San Gabriel Mountains? Some background removal of Tree of Heaven.
Man, that's a really tough question. And mostly because all of our future predictions just really show that things are going to get worse instead of better when it comes to a lot of these. Um, a lot of the open savannas in particular seem to be particularly threatened. And then into the San Gabriels with coast live oak, it really looks like that area is starting to turn more towards chaparral, where you're not going to be able to support as many of those large coast live oak individuals into the future. Because again, it's all about water and water availability. Are you close to the water table that you can put a taproot down to really be a big tree, really have a constant source of water, even if it doesn't rain for 6 to 8 months at a time sometimes, and really be able to hang out in that environment and grow to these large sizes is kind of an open question, kind of difficult to be able to try and replenish an ecosystem like that was really dominated by more wide open spaces, less shrubs, things like that. Fire in particular, the fire regimes are changing so rapidly that even though coast live oak is really good at coming back from a fire, it sprouts, all of its leaves can burn out and it'll sprout new branches from the trunk and stuff like that where it wasn't nearly as burned, even from a stump if it almost burns all the way to the ground. But fire regime is just so much more intense and so much more frequent than it used to be that even trying to plant the seedlings that allow it to replenish this habitat and make it similar to what it was even 20, 30 years ago, what it might have been in the foothills of St. Gabriel's and places like that. It's a difficult question. Um, my best estimate is that we're going to see more widespread chaparral in some of those areas and just fewer of the nice, big, beautiful coast live oak that we used to see there, just because it's the way that the habitat is going in light of less rain, more frequent drought, more frequent fire, just a lot of invasive species like Tree of Heaven really moving into areas that used to be more pristine, I guess, that are now really difficult to get back to that point. Yeah, really tough question.
Great answer. Well, thank you so much for these wonderful questions. We have a lot more actually, but I feel like we should have a full-up session because the amount of interest and engagement is just incredible.
Yeah.
And your your expertise is just amazing. So what I'll do is, do you mind sharing your email address, Scott?
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
then individuals can feel free to relay their questions to him. And I just want to say thank you, Scott. Thank you so much. Thank you to everybody who tuned in. Thank you for listening. Thank you for following Tree People. This was an amazing turnout. So yeah, we really love, bringing in guest speakers and experts, and your research again is just so relevant and just fascinating. So
Yeah, glad to have been here. Glad to have given this talk. I'm really happy that people are interested in this because I love oaks and I love talking about it.
yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, we're all like scared about the future and how the environment is going to impact wildlife and organisms. So your work is so valuable.
Yeah,
And if
thank
there
you.
is a way to save certain species of oaks, even in specific traits, like I think it's hopeful, that there's researchers out there doing this kind of work.
Yeah,
So
I like to try and end on a hopeful note that even though things look bad, maybe we have an option. It's just hard.
yes,
Real.
yeah. I think that you can't be an environmentalist without being hopeful. It's just too depressing. But so actually, we will send a in case you missed it, follow up, and that's where we'll share Scott's email address.
Yep.
So,
And I just shared it to the chat for
okay,
everyone.
perfect. And we'll also be sharing after. This recording will be up on our website. And again, thank you. We'll see you next time.
Thanks a lot for coming, everyone.
You're so gorgeous.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.